The emotional reaction does not usually arrive at temples or neon intersections. It tends to surface quietly, often in ordinary places, when the contrast becomes too precise to ignore. For many Americans, Canadians, and Australians, the first visit to Japan introduces an atmosphere that feels carefully tuned rather than accidental. Streets appear composed rather than chaotic. Public spaces function with a sense of mutual awareness. Even crowded areas feel strangely calm, as if noise has been filtered before reaching the surface. This contrast alone can trigger an unexpected emotional release, not from spectacle, but from a subtle sense of order that feels both unfamiliar and deeply affecting. Early impressions often focus on how little friction exists in daily movement. Trains arrive with near-perfect timing. Sidewalks flow without visible negotiation. Queues form instinctively, without instruction or enforcement. For visitors from cultures where efficiency is often discussed but rarely embodied so quietly, the experience can feel disarming. The absence of tension becomes noticeable. There is no need to brace against disorder. The body relaxes before the mind fully understands why, and that physical release can carry emotion with it. Sensory details reinforce this reaction. The soundscape is softer than expected for a dense society. Doors close gently. Announcements are measured. Even commercial districts seem designed to guide rather than overwhelm. For many Americans, Canadians, and Australians accustomed to constant stimulation, this restraint can feel like entering a different emotional climate. It highlights how much background stress is typically accepted as normal at home. The realization does not arrive as criticism, but as contrast. As the days pass, attention shifts to the way systems anticipate human needs. Public restrooms are immaculate and intuitive. Convenience stores offer warmth, light, and predictability at all hours. Lost items are returned with surprising consistency. These experiences are small, but they accumulate. They suggest an environment built on consideration rather than enforcement. For visitors raised in cultures where trust is often conditional, this consistency can feel almost intimate, producing a quiet emotional response that feels disproportionate until it is examined. This is often the moment when tears appear unexpectedly, not from joy alone, but from recognition. The environment reflects a version of daily life that feels gentler, more attentive, and less adversarial. It exposes how much emotional energy is typically spent navigating disorder, suspicion, and noise. The realization is not that one culture is superior, but that different priorities shape entirely different emotional baselines. And that discovery, arriving without warning, can be overwhelming enough to bring even the most composed travelers to silence. Over time, this emotional response deepens as social behavior becomes more visible. Politeness in Japan is not expressed through warmth or verbal reassurance, but through predictability and restraint. Interactions remain respectful without demanding emotional engagement. For many Americans, Canadians, and Australians, this creates an unfamiliar sense of safety. There is no pressure to perform friendliness, no need to signal intent constantly. The boundaries are clear, and within those boundaries, movement becomes easier. What stands out most is the absence of confrontation in everyday exchanges. Mistakes are absorbed quietly. Delays are acknowledged without escalation. Apologies are offered not as admissions of failure, but as gestures of balance. Visitors from cultures where assertiveness is often necessary to be seen may begin to notice how rarely voices rise. The emotional temperature remains low, even in moments that might provoke frustration elsewhere. This consistency can feel deeply calming and also quietly unsettling, as it challenges long-held assumptions about how order is maintained. Public responsibility becomes another source of reflection. Trash is scarce despite limited public bins. Shared spaces remain clean without visible enforcement. These patterns suggest a collective agreement rather than surveillance. For Americans, Canadians, and Australians accustomed to rules backed by reminders, signage, or penalties, the trust embedded in this system can feel emotionally disarming. It implies an expectation of consideration that is neither stated nor negotiated. The realization that such a social contract can exist changes how visitors perceive their own daily environments. Moments of solitude intensify these feelings. Parks are quiet without feeling empty. Cafes allow silence without discomfort. Even solitude feels socially accepted rather than suspicious. For many visitors, This contrasts sharply with cultures where silence often demands explanation or is quickly filled. The emotional effect is subtle but cumulative. Without constant social signaling, internal awareness increases, thoughts slow, sensations sharpen, emotions that are usually managed or postponed begin to surface naturally. This is why the emotional release often feels confusing. Nothing dramatic has occurred. No personal story has unfolded. Yet the environment itself creates space for reflection that rarely exists at home. The tears are not about Japan alone, but about what becomes visible in its presence, the weight of constant vigilance, the exhaustion of noise, and the longing for environments that ask less of the nervous system. These realizations do not arrive as conclusions, but as quiet recognitions, unfolding slowly as the contrast becomes impossible to ignore. As the visit nears its end, these impressions begin to reorganize into something more lasting. The experience stops being about novelty and becomes a lens. Many Americans, Canadians, and Australians find themselves reassessing what they previously considered normal. The constant urgency back home, the background aggression of public spaces, the need to assert presence just to move through a day, all of it becomes more visible after existing, even briefly, in a system that minimizes friction rather than normalizing it. What makes this realization emotionally powerful is that it does not arrive as idealization. Visitors are aware of Japan's pressures, its expectations, and its limits. The emotional response does not come from believing this environment is perfect, but from understanding that cultural design directly shapes emotional life. The calm is not accidental. The quiet is not passive. It is maintained through shared restraint, mutual awareness, and an understanding that individual behavior influences collective atmosphere. This awareness alone can be enough to unsettle deeply ingrained assumptions. For many, the most difficult moment comes not during the stay, but afterward. Returning home reintroduces noise, unpredictability, and confrontation at full volume. The contrast can feel physical. Crowded spaces suddenly seem harsher. Everyday interactions feel louder, faster, and less patient. The emotional system, briefly recalibrated, struggles to readjust. The tears that first appeared in Japan may return later, not out of sadness for leaving, but from the recognition of what daily life demands elsewhere. Ultimately, the reason people cry is not because Japan overwhelms them emotionally, but because it removes pressure so efficiently that buried emotions finally surface. It creates an environment where the nervous system is not constantly braced, where attention can soften instead of scanning for disruption. In that quiet space, reflection becomes unavoidable. The experience lingers not as a memory of places visited, but as a question carried forward about how societies choose to move, to coexist, and to shape the emotional lives of the people within them.